You are looking at Paul Hodgkins. He's 38 years old from Florida, and there he is on the floor of the United States Senate on January 6th. He got in big trouble, and today a judge sentenced him to 8 months in prison for one count, a felony count, of obstructing a government proceeding. He faced up to 20 years. Nobody saw him breaking anything, though, and no one saw him hurting anybody. But he's going to be in jail for some time, and he may have already served in jail for some time. I want to bring in his attorney, Patrick Leduc. Welcome back, sir. Number one, has your client been in custody ever since January 6th?
No, he was never taken into custody other than the day he was arrested. And then after that, he was released and monitored. He had an ankle monitor.
What day was he arrested?
It's a good question. It was mid-February. I don't have the exact date.
You know, it's interesting. And by the way, great lawyering. I mean, he wasn't engaged in violence as far as we saw. He's on the floor there. He was in jail just for a short time, but there are others who are still in federal custody. And I say this respectfully and with admiration. What makes your client different?
Well, I think, there's a number of things. He had no prior record. Like you mentioned at the top, that he wasn't involved in any violence or any property damage. He went there by himself. He followed the crowd into the Capitol, like the lady who took the misdemeanor a couple of weeks ago, got 36 months probation. She wandered in and found herself in the rotunda. Paul followed the crowd in, and this was around 2:50, which was about an hour after the Senate and the House of Representatives began to leave the chambers. And he wandered in and found himself on the floor of the Senate, as you're showing, and was in the building about 20 minutes, give or take, on the floor of the Senate, between 5 and 10 minutes at most.
Let me ask you something, if you don't mind. I have to jump in. There's a picture up here, and something is circled. Your client seems to be holding something. Let's advance to that picture, if you don't mind. What is that, and why is it circled?
There are just things in life that make me go and just wonder. Those are latex gloves. Paul was an Eagle Scout, and he had a first aid kit. And that gentleman standing in front of him was bleeding out of his cheek. Apparently, he'd gotten shot by a rubber bullet. And Paul was attempting to help that young man and was going to render first aid. The gentleman begged off, and so Paul put his gloves on and was going to render first aid, and he didn't want it. He took them off, and that was the end of that. But for the longest period of time, they were so cynical about it. It took a long time to kind of convince them otherwise that, why was he wearing the gloves? Was he going to rustle through everybody's papers? Because a lot of the people on that Senate floor were doing some things with people's personal items that they shouldn't have.
All right, so you actually put a letter in, you submitted a letter, and you wrote this: whatever punishment this court may provide will pale in comparison to the scarlet letter Mr. Hodgkins will bear for the rest of his life. And I think you imply, or let me ask you, you're not implying shame here. I mean, this is obviously, it's a felony conviction that he'll have, and it'll be on his record. But as we said, he didn't break anything, and we saw pictures of cops letting folks into the Capitol. We saw another picture where it seemed like Capitol Hill police, just outside the Senate chamber, were more or less escorting people inside. So how does he feel overall about what he's done?
I think this issue of shame is an interesting one you put up. That's the way the country's treating one another. My entire sentencing memorandum that you quoted, I referenced Lincoln's second inaugural address where he talked about with malice towards none and charity to all. We live in a society today that doesn't understand grace. About 70% of the country will claim to be Christian, but really about 10% take biblical Christianity seriously. And about 10% of the country understand what it means to receive grace, heavenly grace. And because they've received forgiveness, they're able to give it. But we live in a country today that's a bunch of stone throwers. And we live in a cancel culture where everybody looks to cancel one another. And because people haven't received grace, they can't give it. And so this issue of shame that you bring forth is exactly what the point is. There are a large percentage of Americans who will, without any sense of their own sinfulness or hypocrisy, will cast stones in Paul's direction because he did this. And the problem is people don't understand that we're all going to count. We're all going to, we're all going to stand before a heavenly judge to be judged and give him an account. And how we treat others is how we're going to be held to account in that situation. People have not received vertical grace, and they can't give it horizontally. And so that's the problem we have in this country today is we're a bunch of Americans seeking to cancel one another out. We're not willing to give forgiveness. And when Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, with malice towards none, with charity towards all, after a civil war where 700,000 people or upwards of that had been killed, Lincoln understood that to heal the country required forgiveness. Now, the requisite of forgiveness is acceptance of responsibility, to say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm seeking forgiveness. But when a person does that, that means that we, as Americans, should give grace and should give forgiveness. And that was part of the point I was trying to make in today's arguments in my sentencing memorandum.
Paul, I love what you just said, really. By the way, you know who's the chief stone thrower these days, it seems like? The President of the United States. He could be showing mercy. He could be showing a lot of things that we're not seeing from him. Very quickly before we go, do you know anything about the Horns guy? He's still in custody. He's been in custody, unlike your client, ever since that day or shortly thereafter. Like your client, I didn't see him hurt anybody. I didn't see him damage anything, but he's still in jail. It sounds outrageous. And just your observations, your insight, if you're at all familiar.
You'll have to forgive me. I don't. I think Paul was Paul was this interesting test case of a person that had, like the woman in the rotunda. How do we treat a person on the Senate versus a person in the rotunda? And I think Judge Moss was struggling with that. His Senate, the United States wanted him to have 18 months. I wanted him to have, basically house arrest, which is no confinement. The judge split the difference. So. I can't complain about the sentence. It's not everything I wanted, but I think the judge was closer to me. And I appreciate the fact that the judge seemed to appear, I objected pretty vociferously about the labeling of this as a domestic terrorism. It was not. It was a protest that turned into a riot. It was unacceptable.
We are out of time, and I need 5 more seconds, if you don't mind. This Judge Moss, will he be deciding all of the sentences in this case? No, he's not. Okay, very good. Just, well, your client is the first, and 8 months in jail, starting, I guess, right about now, more or less. Keep in touch. Patrick Leduc, attorney for Paul Hodgkins. We appreciate it so much. To be continued, sir, and we'll be right back.
You just watched Newsmax TV, America's fastest growing cable news channel, now in more than 70 million homes. You can get Newsmax TV on your cable system or check your cable guide. And if your system doesn't carry Newsmax, call them, tell them you want Newsmax TV, because we're real news for real people.